no family in Britain which doesn't have someone who's been damaged by alcohol through addiction, through violence, traffic accidents. Almost every family in Britain is affected. We know there's a problem, but we don't talk about it because hiding away the problems has been something we've become very expert at. My main role is to educate psychiatrists and other doctors about what I'm doing. As a brain scientist, that's what I want to understand. I want to understand the brain. And alcohol is a very interesting probe of different brain systems. In Western cultures, alcohol is the most harmful drug overall because it's the most harmful drug to society, because it's the most widely used drug.
So it's just part of life. It's part of, because we don't want to face what for many people is their own drug problem, and we don't want to talk about it.
You're encouraged to drink it. The government allows advertising. Governments don't want us to talk. That's why I was sacked. We want to talk about it in the Misuse of Drugs Act. And they said, you can't. And the Home Office said, we don't want you to.
You want people just to understand it as a drug and a substance and to use it in an optimal way, right?
Absolutely. And that's why I said it.
If you do drink, there's no reason to increase. And if you want to cut back, that's always better.
And now people do know the facts. And now they know the facts. They want to talk about it. Now we have a proper, open, independent discussion about drugs.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go? This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Professor David Nutt wants to talk to you about alcohol and drugs. And as the Deputy Head Professor for the Center for Psychedelic Research at Imperial College London, he should know. And you might remember David for famously being sacked in 2009 for working for the government and saying that ecstasy was actually safer than alcohol and tobacco. And what I love about David is that he runs the numbers. And statistically, it's true. Alcohol is the most dangerous drug in the world. It causes more harm, more death, more cost in this country to the National Health Service than anything out there, and yet it's deeply intertwined into our culture. And so we don't think of it as a drug. And David has a great new book out called Drinking, where he goes through a lot of our common assumptions about alcohol and how we can really look at this drug and try to manage it in our lives. It's something I struggled with for 30 years, drinking almost every single day. I've been sober for 2 years, and it's been a massive game changer for me. Also, David went on and talked about a lot of the psychedelic research that his center is doing, groundbreaking research with LSD, psilocybin, and DMT to get people suffering from addiction, depression, anorexia. This is a fascinating episode. David Nutt is an extreme pioneer in this space. He's a man we should build a statue for. I love his spirit, I love his ideas, and I love his work, and you are going to love this incredible episode with David Nutt. This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Professor David Nutt, the neuro-psycho-pharmacologist specializing in the research of drugs that affect addiction, anxiety, and depression. You are the deputy head for the Center for Psychedelic Research at Imperial College London, alongside Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris and Dr. Rosalind Watts, both of whom recently appeared on the show. In 2009, you famously asserted that ecstasy and LSD were less harmful than alcohol, and you were subsequently fired from the Government Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs. Your latest book, Drink, explores the science of alcohol, its detrimental effects on one's health, and the damage it causes to humankind. David, welcome back to London Real.
A pleasure being here, Ryan.
This is your third time on this show, David. Over 6 or 7 years.
Lifetime Achievement Award.
Look, it's great to have you back. We've got a lot to talk about. The book is very interesting. Also, everything you're doing at Imperial College, a lot of stuff I didn't even know about. I'd love to talk about everything you're doing with marijuana, with the psychedelics, MDMA.
Yep.
and everything as well. So super excited to have you here. I wanted to kick off and talk about something that I posted recently and the reaction I got to it. So as I think I just told you, I've been 2 years now without alcohol.
Right.
Before that, if I could be really honest, I probably struggled with alcohol for 30 years of my life. Started drinking in my teens, like a lot of people, and then pretty much drank heavily in college at my fraternity house, then on to Wall Street, where that was kind of what we did, and pretty much drank every day for a large part of my life. And it was something, David, that I just couldn't figure out. And it was something I struggled with because, you know, if you look on the degrees on my wall, I'm supposed to be a smart guy, but I couldn't figure this out. And it was damaging me physically, my self-esteem, and I could never really figure it out. And I posted this 20-minute vlog talking about this on my channel, and it's been watched about 150,000 times. Wow. And so I think it shows me that a lot of people struggle with this. Indeed. A lot of people don't understand what's going on. And I think it's because it's wrapped up with a lot of things you talk about in the book, because it's not considered a drug by many, which has been kind of the story of your career. It's woven into the fabric of our society. Correct. And you could have a grandfather that would never do drugs, but he'll drink a fifth of Jack Daniels every day.
Exactly.
And so it was really eye-opening to me the way people reacted and responded to this confession. For me, it's been a powerful just thing for me to realize. And I mentioned one of the movies we made last year was Iron Mind, and you probably didn't know, but I openly talked about my struggle also with heroin in 2001, and even an overdose I had when I was in New York City. Oh, wow. So I've kind of been through various stages of different types of drugs and can understand the harmfulness and less harmfulness, but I thought I would just kick it off mentioning that, and the fact that a lot of people, I think, are interested in understanding alcohol, their relationship with it. And so it's powerful that you wrote this book.
Well, that was one of the reasons I wrote the book, because if you remember, I start off, the very first paragraph is about how my first evening at university, I'm confronted with the effects of alcohol on 18-year-olds, effects I'd never seen before. I hadn't really drunk very much before I went to university. The first night, the medical students were sitting around, and then one of them, they get drunk, very drunk, I get a bit drunk, and one of them just starts to cry, and I'm thinking he's going to kill himself. He's weeping and wailing, and I'm saying, should we get an ambulance? And another one of the other guys who went to the same school as him said, no, he's always like that when he's drunk. And I'm thinking, wow, isn't that interesting? You know, this drug which you can just go and buy in the shops can produce these enormous changes in people's minds. And in fact, that guy had problems with alcohol most of his life. The guy that told me not to worry actually died of alcoholism. 2 of the 9 undergraduates in that class in medicine, Downing College, Cambridge, 1969, 2 that their lives were seriously blighted by alcohol.
And these are smart people.
Extremely smart people. You know, it's quite hard to get into Cambridge, and it's very hard to get to do medicine. Yeah, I mean, academically they're up there, but it's intellect, as in your case, is not a defense against the vulnerabilities of drinking, and why that should be is interesting. I'll come on to that perhaps in a minute. But the reason I've written the book. There's never really been a book like this that actually helps people understand their drinking. There's hundreds of books on how to stay sober, and there's quite a lot of books on what it's like to be an alcoholic. But I don't think there's one that actually says, look, try to understand your drinking, try to make sense of it, try to work out why you drink. And if you are having problems, well, actually, this is the first book that sort of helps, I think, people make sense of the normal problems as opposed to the extremes, which is like, if you're losing your job because of drink, well, you've got a problem. But a lot of people get into difficulties with drink without even really understanding.
Right. Why do you have a hangover? Why does it affect me less when I eat? Why does it affect different people differently? Like, you cover a lot of those things in there.
Yeah, I try to. I mean, so that was 1969, and that's 40 years ago. So I've tried to distill my wisdom, not just my scientific wisdom, because I've researched alcohol for 40 years, but also just my life wisdom in terms of being around a lot of people, friends, family, acquaintances who drink as well.
When I got to this country back in the late 90s, for me it felt like alcohol and the history of Britain and the culture of Britain are very interwoven.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, the point is, until the mid-1800s, it wasn't safe to drink the water in most parts of Britain. That the standard drink in Britain through the Middle Ages was what we call small beer. It was a weak beer of about 2%, 2.5%. And you gave it to kids, everyone drank it because it was safe, because the fermenting of the beer killed the bugs,
Right.
killed the bacteria. So, and and until we got proper hygienics, water provisions back in the sort of 1860s, 1870s, that was what people drank. So it was part of our life. It was called small beer. And then when you have a party, you had the real beer, the strong beer.
Right. All right.
The heavy beer.
So it's just part of life. It's part of everything.
Goes back beyond, but you go back to the Bible.
Yeah.
One of Jesus's great miracles was turning water into wine, because you couldn't celebrate a wedding appropriately without wine. Of course, the ancient Greeks used alcohol a lot, along with psychedelics, particularly the sort of ergot fungi, to get experiences and alter their consciousness. The Romans had their back in there. Alcohol pervades Western society.
Yeah. And that's why I watched one of your interviews that you did on the BBC maybe 6 years ago, back today. And when you start bringing up some of your research and start telling them that factually these drugs that have all of this emotional baggage, like LSD and MDMA and crack, are maybe be less dangerous than alcohol, it's just funny to see sometimes that people have this reaction like, no. This is what I have, my grandpa had, I have at my weddings, and this is for those people over there that are throwing their lives away. It's visceral.
And it's visceral because people don't want it to be true. So there are two things I would say about this. The first is that at both a conscious and a subconscious level, people are fearful of other drugs, illegal drugs, because it helps deflect their attention away from the problems of alcohol at a personal level, but also at a political level. Politicians love to get hysterical about a new drug because it means they can do something about drugs, and they don't have to be held to account over their failure to deal with the problems of alcohol.
Right.
So that's the first thing. The second thing is that I would say that there's almost no family in Britain, if you look at an extended family, 3 generations, in which doesn't have someone who's been damaged by alcohol through addiction, through violence, traffic accidents, or being a victim because of someone else who was drunk and violent.
Right.
Almost every family in Britain is affected. But we don't own up to it.
Right.
We kind of push it under the carpet. We know there's a problem, but we don't talk about it because, well, we don't know what to do about it. We're embarrassed. And so that shoveling alcohol, hiding away the problems has been something we've become very expert at.
Very good at. And so, because we don't want to face what for many people is their own drug problem, because their own dependency on alcohol.
Absolutely.
To a certain extent. Yeah. And since it's not a drug, it's alcohol or a tobacco, it's normal, and we don't want to talk about it.
And governments don't want us to talk. That's why I was sacked, because they did not want. We said, well, look, alcohol's a drug. Obviously, alcohol's a drug. Of course, it's a drug because it changes the way your brain works. Of course, it's a drug. And they said, no, we want to talk about it in the Misuse of Drugs Act. And they said, you can't. And we said, of course, the Misuse of Drugs Act doesn't say we can't. And the Home Office said, we don't want you to. And we said, well, I don't care. We're going to, that's science. We've got to do it. And that's why I got sacked, really. Because once you start evaluating the comparative harms, particularly to society, of different drugs. You see alcohol is way, way more damaging to society than ecstasy or mushrooms or LSD.
It's the most damaging drug to society as a whole.
It is. And what's interesting about that is that we did that very sophisticated analysis back in 2010, published in The Lancet. That was really why I got sacked, because it kind of showed it was, and I said it was. But then two things have happened subsequently. The first was that the European Director of Justice gave us some money to redo that analysis in Europe. He was particularly interested in the comparative harms of other drugs, but we said, of course, we've got to do the same 20 drugs. We've got to put alcohol in. And we redid it with 30 European experts, 20 different countries, and alcohol came out the top there. Then last year, we redid it in Australia, same thing. In the Western cultures, alcohol is the most harmful drug overall because it's the most harmful drug to society, because it's the most widely used drug.
Right. And it creates all sorts of collateral damage. If you go to the A&E, the emergency room on a weekend, it's almost all alcohol related.
Absolutely, up to 90%, that's right. And we put up with that. And we put up with that. We put up with that because the media lie about it. There's this terrible, the reason alcohol is never in the spotlight is because politicians don't want it there because they get kickbacks from the drinks industry. The drinks industry doesn't want it in the spotlight because they're making it, I mean, it's the easiest way to make money is to sell booze.
The margins are ridiculous.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then the newspapers are in the pay, I mean, the newspapers get a lot of support, encouragement for the drinks industry, free booze, not to take on criticism, or not to criticize or accept criticism of the drinks industry. So you find if for every time I say something that is critical, you get nanny state, you get scaremonger, you get let us drink what we want, we're adults and all that kind of crap. And actually, the only way I think we can get around this, apart from education, as in the book, is one, but the only other way is to keep banging on about the cost implications. For a normal rate taxpayer, about £1,000 of your tax each year is going to support binge drinking. The damage on our streets you see every weekend from kids getting drunk. Obviously, if you're a higher rate taxpayer, there's more. Now, I calculated if we had brought in just a simple measure like they're doing in Scotland, minimum unit pricing, which would have no impact on the cost of what the taxpayers pay, because they're buying booze at more than the minimum price anyway. But it would reduce consumption in young people, reduce consumption in people who are alcohol dependent. By reducing consumption in those two extremes, you actually reduce the costs of alcohol because they're the ones that are getting into fights, those are the ones that are going to hospital. So I reckon minimum pricing would actually make taxpayers better off because it would save money in police budgets and health budgets.
But that was rejected in England.
It was rejected. It's been rejected many times in England. I mean, I think they're going to bring it in Northern Ireland and Wales soon. But they brought it in Scotland and it is working. I mean, Scotland, before they brought it in, 40% of all intensive care beds in Scotland were occupied by people with an alcohol problem. 40%. Now, if you reduce consumption in those people just by 10%, because the relationship between alcohol and harm is so curvilinear, if you just reduce consumption by 10%, you can reduce harm at the extremes by 30, 40%. You can get them out of intensive care into ordinary bed. And an intensive care bed is what, £10,000 a night, and ordinary bed's £1,000 a night. I mean, you can save a huge amount of money by making relatively small changes in pricing that just affect the most vulnerable people. But all the time, people say, I don't want more tax. I don't want to pay more for my booze. You won't pay more. You'll save money on taxation. But to get the standard media to accept that is really difficult. Eventually, I mean, a few years ago, I did manage to get The Spectator to take an article on that. That's the only newspaper that's actually really dared to sort of put that message out.
And this is this minimum price for alcohol, so
Correct. Minimum price per unit. Yeah.
Isn't flooded with cheap alcohol.
Correct.
Okay.
I mean, it's absurd, isn't it? You can go into supermarkets and buy alcohol at a less price than water. I mean, it is a weird world when that can happen.
Very weird, but it's a powerful industry.
It's probably the most sophisticated lobbying industry, maybe defense, I don't know. But I mean, the alcohol industry is very clever. They watched what happened to tobacco, and they learnt the lessons. They didn't actually lie, unlike the tobacco industry lied.
Right.
It's not addictive. Oh, but you got data. They didn't lie. They just made it appear that they were taking it seriously. And they said, and then they started putting out messages: drink responsibly.
Right.
Well, that's a great. I'd love to. You'd love to. Wouldn't we all? The whole point of drink is to lose responsibility. In a way, that was their sort of gesture to try to reduce the harms of alcohol, which is. I mean, we know it's a rather weak way of changing people's behavior.
Yeah, it's funny. I look at these Jack Daniels advertisements that are on the tube, and I always read their copy because they always got some funny story.
Yes.
And they're talking about the history of Jack. And again, it's this whole glamorization of and the story of, and your grandpa did it, and the tough guys have a drink after work, and the whole thing. And then it says the very end, drink responsibly.
Yes.
But I know they want to sell me 4 bottles at a time.
Absolutely.
But so they are super smart in how they do that. And of course, the whole glamorization, the advertising, the marketing is very intelligent.
Yeah, I mean, they buy the best people. I mean, with the budget that I think they spend maybe 1,000 or 10,000 times more advertising booze than they do advertising the health harms of booze. You know, I mean, they completely saturate all the information you get about booze is almost always driven by the drinks industry.
Okay. Some facts. I mean, it right now is the leading cause of death amongst men in the UK, ages 16 to 54.
Correct.
That would be shocking for most people to hear.
And that's why I want to keep beating that drum. And it's going to be the same for women. In a couple of years, it'll be the same, it'll be the leading cause of death in women, because we're seeing a remarkable change in women's drinking. Women under the age of 40 now drink more than men. Why? Because they're richer than men. Women got better jobs, they got better education, better jobs, and they often live with their parents so that they can actually, they've got more disposable income. So women are actually drinking more than men. And because women have got different metabolism, they get affected more for the same consumption. So we're going to see that in women as well, and it's very scary.
Wow. And this manifests itself in personal harm, cirrhosis of the liver, cancer, and then fatal injuries based on this drinking.
That's right.
And then you even go down and break down like the years that come off your life. And
yeah, did you find that interesting?
I mean, 2 bottles of wine per day, knowing that could take off 21 years of your life is pretty sobering. And I know guys in the city that drink 2 bottles of wine a day easily.
Really?
Oh yeah. And it's kind of minimum. You're out, and that's kind of happens.
What?
Yeah. There's a lot of drinking.
Well, they tell them, yeah, and this is because there's this peculiar relationship, this curvilinear relationship between alcohol and harm. It goes up very much like this. I mean, it goes up so steeply. You eventually, you just die of alcohol poisoning. You'd have to drink more than. That's one of the amazing things I discovered in my research over the years. Is in Russia, they don't die of cirrhosis. The Scots have the highest cirrhosis rates in the world because they drink enough, but they don't drink too much to instantly kill them. In Russia, they drink so much that they just die of alcohol poisoning. Half of all Russian men die of alcohol poisoning before they get cirrhosis. It's utterly absurd.
Wow. And their lifespan is really short.
That's right. It's like 15, 20 years less than ours now.
Is that an extreme example you look at sometimes?
Well, Russia's a fantastic example because we've got data going back to the Second World War. Russia must be maybe the only country outside Africa where life expectancy has gone down since the Second World War. So in Britain, in most of Europe, men's life expectancy has gone up by about 12 years since the Second World War. I mean, more than women's. We're healthier, we know more, we got better health care, we eat better, less pollution. Russians has gone down and it's all due to alcohol. But, in Russia, they don't consider beer alcohol. Beer looks like lemonade. They don't count beer drink. They don't count how much we don't know how much they drink beer. They drink. They don't count it. But they do. But the drink they drink is vodka. All the vodka in Russia is made by the state. So 20 odd years ago, Gorbachev was horrified by the death rates from alcohol. So he just said, okay, next year, half the production of vodka. Just half the production. So basically, people drank less because there was less available. And you saw that, within a year, life expectancy had gone up by like 2 years. Yeah. And it went up for the next year. But the people revolted. And, Russia is quite a difficult place to live. And then it was worse. And now it's a pretty miserable place. And alcohol is the opium of the masses there. And they rebelled, and he was forced to make it more available. So life expectancy went up, and then he made it more available, it crashed. And the same thing happened about 10 years later, I think, with Yeltsin. So we've seen through government policies that this terrible poor life expectancy is all driven by the availability of alcohol.
Right. And you think that ultimately, by showing the cost benefits, that might get some change in this country. I mean, we're always talking about the NHS and how much it's costing, you know.
Well, I hope so. I mean, look, we can tell, we've been pointing out for decades that, you know, as I say, every family in Britain knows someone that's been damaged by alcohol. But, and this is an important point in the book, people don't do very much because they enjoy alcohol. So how can you get people then to be more rational? And I think the financial argument is easily what I'm going to try, because you know, people are concerned about money. So if you could see that they would actually be better off if we all drank less, or if you'd have to drink a lot less. You just have to reorganize your drinking in society so that the people who are most harmed are less harmed. Right. And then we all benefit.
Now, what's the reaction normally when you give people these stats and tell people what's going on? They don't want to hear it.
No. I mean, it's the people that come to my lectures tend to be believers. They tend to be interested, and the problem is that the people who don't come to my lectures are in the bar and the pub drinking. Is getting that message out to people that we should get it. And so it's got to be taught at schools. One of the real problems, I mean, the last government has been very remiss. It's essentially not made education about drugs and alcohol compulsory in schools. And I just think that's outrageous, because every family in Britain is affected by alcohol. So 10% of the kids going to school have got drunk parents. They need to know what that's about. They need to know how they can seek help. There are kids at 8, 9, 10, 11 who go home and have to look after their parents because they're drunk. It's a devastating situation to be in. But we don't allow the children to talk about it because we don't talk about alcohol and drugs at school. Right.
So we need to have more of a conversation and talk about what's happening with these kids.
I'll tell you a remarkable thing. Perhaps the most remarkable phone-in I ever did was, I think about a year and 18 months ago. I did it on the Radio 4 program called You and Yours. And it was a phone-in for people who had, as children, had their lives negatively affected by a drinking parent. They got more phone calls on that program than in any other of this is a consumer affairs program, You and Yours, that ever had. Most of them, and I was listening for the 45 minutes, most of them were people over the age of 50 who were still traumatized by the damage they'd experienced as a child from their drunken parents. It had never left them. And that was just so moving and so chilling. If you can't forget that kind of treatment as a child. It's a kind of abuse. It's not necessarily, it can be active, but it can be just passive. But having to, worry if you're going to come home and your mother's going to be dead or falling on the floor, it's very disturbing to the children.
Yeah, it's definitely something that's on a lot of people's minds. And I think that's why I got so many comments and views on this vlog, because I think it's something that's affected so many people, their own drinking, other people's drinking, and it's something they can't necessarily control. And they don't have a drug problem, so it's okay because everyone's doing it.
Well, this is why it's such an interesting drug.
Right.
Because apart from caffeine, actually, it may be more popular than coffee. I don't know, but it's the only really psychoactive drug that changes the way you think and feel. That pretty much everyone has experienced. So and that's, for me as a scientist, is very interesting. So when I give lectures, I give lectures often about addiction to psychiatrists, and I say, let's look at the nature of addiction, right? Let's think about addiction. So how many of you drink? 60, 70% put their hands up. How many of you are alcoholic? No one puts their hand up. And I say, well, isn't that interesting? Some of you are lying, but never mind. But more than that, it tells you that because we know that 10% of drinkers they're different. So we have a legal drug, the government endorses, and some people drink safely and some people don't. So that must be a difference in the person. It's not about will, it's about the fact that their body responds differently to the drug. And again, there's a lot about that in the book, trying to understand the vulnerabilities that people have why some people actually lose control when they drink and others drink excessively to deal with problems like stress.
And what are some of those facts? I mean, you talk about having a drink diary in there. You talk about understanding how alcohol affects different people's genetics and different cultures. And like, what are some of the things you want people to understand?
Well, the first thing is I want people to understand that having a problem with alcohol is not your fault, because not everyone has it. So how can it be your fault? I mean, you're encouraged to drink it. The government allows advertising. It wants you to drink. You have a problem with drink. It's definitely not your fault. So the question then is, the first important thing is then, can you recognize you've got a problem? And that's where, drink diaries are quite useful. Because sometimes it's difficult to, if you ask people you've got a problem, sometimes they'll be embarrassed to tell you, or you might get angry with them, or they might be scared you'll get angry. But keeping a drink diary is at least a way of beginning to get some sort of insight into what you're drinking. And actually, one of the great things about a drink diary is that you can then kind of give a score as to what the value of that drink was. Was that a really good drink? Did you get a great deal of pleasure? Did you have a really good dinner party? Or were you just drinking it because everyone else was drinking, you were bored? So that way you can potentially eliminate some of the drinking, which isn't giving you the pleasure that you want. That's the first thing.
Okay.
But the other thing is to really be very clear. Are you drinking to deal with something else? Because my view is drink is a great social drug. It's probably the most socially enabling, certainly of the legal drugs, it's the most socially enabling by far.
Yeah.
And that's, that I think is how we should use it. We should use it to facilitate social interaction and interchange and pleasure. But if you're not using it for those purposes, then almost by definition, you've got a problem with it.
And that was my story. I would drink alone. I would drink to get away from, I think, my own inner critic. I think that's what I was getting away, because I just needed a break from all the pressure I was putting on myself. So I would drink alone. And I would see people that could drink and have one drink and then go home. I'd be like, how do you even do that? Or drink once a week or once a month. And I was like, wow, that's amazing, because I couldn't,
Yeah, that's so. Yeah, so you just stopped, did you?
Well, to be really honest, David, when I started this show, I think a lot of alcoholics are isolated as well.
Quite.
And so that was a lot of me. I just felt isolated from the rest of the world. And this show got me really connected to the rest of the world and made me feel included and loved, and also depended on, and I was an example of. And by doing that repeatedly, I started needing the alcohol less and less and less, until finally I was like, you know what? I don't need you anymore, and I'm going to make a distinct choice that I'm not going to use it even as a minor crutch here and there. Yeah. So that was kind of my evolution. But that whole thing, it's not your fault. I remember going to buy a bottle of vodka from the corner shop guy, and he would be looking at me like, here you are again. And I'd be like, I hate myself right now. I hate how I'm being judged. I hate judging myself, but I still need to buy this thing. And that was hard.
And it's what it's great you're sharing, and that's a very classic example of how the problem builds up. And drinking alone is almost always a problem. So that's one of the things. If we just said to people, what's the best way of reducing your harms? Never drink alone. Never. If you could do that, it's difficult. And that's the other thing. So why is it difficult? And this is where alcohol is a really clever drug. Alcohol is a very promiscuous drug. It gets into the brain and it changes all the good neurotransmitters that you want to change. A bit of endorphins, a bit of serotonin, a bit of GABA. It's a really clever drug. And gradually it sort of worms its way into you. So eventually it kind of takes over, and you get to the situation like, that you described. And I've had patients of mine who say they just find themselves drinking. They don't even intend to drink. They're just suddenly there drinking. They don't know how they got there. They don't want to do it. They don't even enjoy it very much, but they can't stop. It becomes a compulsion.
And you give yourself the celebratory drink. I had a hard day at work, I'm gonna have a scotch. Mm-hmm. We got married, let's have some champagne. Yes. We won, it's just all ingrained in the culture. And then you get there and you're like, why am I drinking this? you don't know why sometimes you're doing it anymore.
No, because it becomes, see, this is one of the interesting things, and this is true of other addictions as well, but
Yes.
alcohol is the kind of the biggest problem because it's the most used drug, but it's that your brain is a really efficient organ. Your brain tries to make as much of what you do habitual as possible. You don't want to be thinking about everything, because
Right.
thinking's hard work. You want it just be, imagine if you had to think every time you made a sentence, if you had to write it down before you go mad. So your brain, it learns to be very, very efficient. And when you start drinking, it just learns to take over and to stop it being conscious and make it a habit. And once it becomes a habit, it's like biting your nails or habits are really hard to break. They're in a different part of the brain. Actually, it's very hard to unlearn. Once you've learned something to a habit level, it's very hard to unlearn it. And that's why so many people relapse.
Right, and you see an old buddy, and you're always having a beer with him, and end of a long day, and it's already there. It's
Or
a
even just
habit.
talking about it. I begin to salivate for my next beer. I'm thinking, a long day for me. I really could, it'd be lovely to have a bit cold beer now, chatting with you, because it's very conditioned.
Yeah, and that's what I love about you, David, because you have a wine bar in Ealing. So I think that's actually makes this even more interesting because you're not going out and saying everyone should be a teetotaler, everyone should stop drinking. You want people just to understand it as a drug and a substance and to use it in an optimal way, right?
Absolutely. Optimize your drinking. And drinking, the best times we all have with drinking are when we do it socially. It's the ultimate social drug, legal drug. So let's drink socially. That's how we tended to drink. We tended to drink in pubs in England or bars in other countries. We drank with family around the table. Drink socially. Ideally outside the home. One of the reasons we've got such a big increase in alcohol consumption in Britain in the last 40 years is because we have brought alcohol into our homes. We didn't used to. When I was a kid, we didn't have alcohol. We didn't drink with me. Well, maybe on a Sunday lunchtime we might have a sherry. Now it's almost the norm that everyone drinks at home with almost every meal, and that is not thought. That's what you do. It's become a habit. A kind of cultural habit as opposed to a personal habit. So I think I have a wine bar because the wine bar in Ealing is designed to do two things. It's actually my daughter's wine bar. I'm just sort of supporting her financially with it. But her vision is it's very hard for women to find anywhere to drink where they're not going to be pestered by drunk men. They don't want to go to pubs. There's just soccer playing and there's men falling over them and pouring beer. So this is a kind of little haven where women can go and have quality wine. So it's mostly organic. It's high quality. So you taste it, you enjoy it. You can't slurp it back because it's too expensive. So it's about being part of the experience rather than just getting drunk.
Right, and that was the plan for it.
That was right, absolutely, and it's worked out. And that was her plan. Give women an opportunity, somewhere to go. Again, women are well off now. They want to socialise with their friends. They want to have a drink because it's fun, but there are very few places for them to do it.
Yeah,
certainly in Ealing.
And it's funny how you say that. I mean, if I talked about the optimal times where I was drinking, it was probably in a social situation at a low dose.
Yes.
And the other times is when it wasn't optimal. On the 20th tequila shot, that's not optimal. I don't even know what's happening. I'm doing bad things. Alone, it's not happening. But there was probably a time which, like, I think Brad Pitt came out recently and said, I've had my alcohol privileges revoked. That's what Brad Pitt said. And that's what I've done to myself. For me, I've revoked them from me because I don't think I can handle it, and I'm okay with that, and I'm going to do all these other things.
Well, the other thing is you've got a lot of things to fill in the gap.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's great. I mean, and that's, of course, one of the things for people who've got alcohol problems, we do try to find other things that can interest them and relax them or deal with the stress, but also just to give them something to do. Because that's the problem. If you do spend 2 or 3 nights a week with your mates drinking and then you don't want to drink, it's quite difficult to spend the time with your mates because sometimes they're suspicious of you, sometimes they're critical. sometimes they're quite boring when you're sober.
Yeah, it's funny. When you tell someone you don't drink, a lot of times it makes them uncomfortable.
Very much so.
Because they know that they have a habit, and
Indeed.
I'm sure you've seen a lot of that. Or
Yeah.
yeah. And what I always say is that the only time I ever really think about drinking is when I'm in a social situation I don't necessarily want to be at. Like a lot of people say, I'm going home for Christmas and I'm going to have to drink because I can't handle my parents or whatever it is. And I always say, well, just don't go to those situations.
Yes.
Because you shouldn't have to use alcohol to get through something. Just make another choice.
But you see, isn't that? But that is, that's the power of alcohol. That you go to a social situation that you don't want to go to, a party you don't want to be at, you don't know anyone, and alcohol can just make it bearable. It is a good drug in that sense. It's just the legacy of it can be quite damaging.
Yeah, and in a way, maybe it's a bad drug because it doesn't show you need other choices as well. Maybe find something you enjoy doing.
Yeah, but it's difficult. I mean, you're not going to go into a party and start doing your press-ups, are you?
Yeah, maybe not.
Well,
maybe.
That's the point. Oh my God, it's such a clever drug. Why do we, look at, you get on an airplane, right? 30% of the people on the airplane are terrified of flying. That's why as soon as they start pushing the trolley around, people are getting the drinks down, because it does relax people. There's no question.
Yeah, no, it definitely works. What else should we know about alcohol itself? I mean, the book is great because you walk it through. It is a depressant. It can make you go to sleep, but it's also this kind of a weird short-term sleep.
Yes.
And when you wake up, your brain is now kind of hyperactivated,
right, yeah.
which is why people with hangovers thinks everything's a little loud and the world is a bit too much.
And what's lovely about, we understand all that now. We know what's going on. We know the pharmacology of alcohol in the brain and how it does that. We can explain an enormous amount of what's going on with alcohol.
Right.
To me, I find that quite exciting because as a brain scientist, that's what I want to understand. I want to understand the brain, and alcohol is a very interesting probe of different brain systems, and the changes we see that underpin the effects of alcohol, are relevant to all sorts of disorders. They're relevant to disorders like sleep disorders, relevant to epilepsy, relevant to anxiety, depression.
And the hangover, in its very pure form, is a withdrawal of alcohol. That's usually what people are experiencing.
But it's interesting. But it's not. Everyone doesn't get hangovers.
Okay.
This is one of the reasons I used to run the alcohol research ward at NIH in America for 2 years. I lived in America in Bethesda, went to work at NIH for 2 years, and we used to admit people and alcoholics and detoxify them, get them through there. And I'd interviewed every single patient that went through that ward in 2 years. And I would always ask them standard set of questions. And one of them was, do you get hangovers? And the majority said no. And that's, of course, one of the reasons they drank so much, because, you've had a hangover, I presume.
Oh, yeah.
And I've had hangovers. And don't you always say never again?
Oh, yeah.
You always say never again. And sometimes actually depends on I remember once having the most disgusting, it's not in the book, but I'll share with you. So I drank a bottle of Pernod, 750 mils, on a overnight ferry from Portsmouth to the Havre when I was a student. Halfway across, I started throwing up. And I couldn't smell aniseed without wanting to throw up for like 10 years. I was so sensitized to that experience of vomiting on aniseed. It can lead to very enduring memories too.
And so, but some people don't have the hangovers, which means they're more of a propensity to drink because they don't have that reminder.
And why that is, they still withdraw. That's why we were admitting them to treat them. They were shaking away, they're having delirium, but they don't have hangovers. So hangover is a complex mixture. It's not just withdrawal from alcohol, but it's also some effect of the alcohol on the brain or the body. And we're doing research on this at present now. But actually, there's almost no research. Hangovers must be one of the commonest experiences that people have in terms of pain and distress. And there's almost no research on the brain mechanism of hangover. And we're discovering actually that inflammation seems to be quite an important part. Alcohol can turn on the immune system. The alcohol's broken down to acetaldehyde, that can turn on the immune system. And we can look now in the brains, we're doing studies on mice and rats, and we can see inflammatory markers go up in the brains as well. So it may be that the person's immune system is one of the predictors of whether you get hangovers or not.
Is it true that young people are drinking less?
A group of young people are drinking less.
Okay.
And that's more true in London than elsewhere. So there are these under 24-year-olds, 25-year-olds who are they're either low or no. And they're doing it for reasons of you. They're doing it because, they're your followers. They're into fitness, they're into health. They don't want to be like their parents.
Right.
They've made an active choice. And but the ones who haven't are drinking as much, if not more.
Okay.
Because the actual net consumption's not gone down.
Okay. So we're not anywhere near out of the clear.
I had this wonderful conversation a few years ago when usually they used to wheel me out as a sort of contrarian in press meetings, where they'd have the drinks industry and the pro-drinks lobbyists and all that. And I remember one of them said to me, one of the drinks guys said to me, he said, well, look, David, he said, you're going on about this alcohol problem. Yeah, okay, so it's gone up, 5-fold in the last 20 years, but at least it's flattened out now. Isn't that a good thing? And I thought, no, it's not a good thing, because if you say it's flattened and it's a good thing, then we don't have to worry about the fact it's still 5 times higher than it should be. But that's the kind of way the drinks industry, very, very clever. Well, it's not going up anymore, so it's all right. If it's not rising, it's all right. And to which my response in the book is, well, actually, it's risen by this much. Deaths have risen by 3-fold, 4-fold in terms of liver. So it's not all right. And look at France. If you reduce it to where it was before, you will reduce deaths. So no, it's not all right.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.